Hi everyone, I'm Kate and welcome back. Today we're going to be making Anzac biscuits. These biscuits have quite a significant historical importance for New Zealanders and Australians. I'm going to be making 3 different types of this biscuit today. The first recipe that I'm going to be making is as close to the original recipe as I can get it. It's over 100 years old, the recipe. And then the second one I'm going to make is a recipe from the early 1900s, but closer to World War II time, which started in 1939, World War II. And then the third recipe is a recipe that you would find today. It's had some added extras in comparison to the original recipe, and we're going to try them all and just see how they taste. So first of all, I'm just going to turn the oven on to 200 degrees centigrade. So this recipe has got 2 types of flour in it, wholemeal flour and normal flour. It calls for self-raising flour. I haven't got self-raising flour, so I'll just add in some baking powder to make it into self-raising flour. So 1.5 cups of ordinary flour. And then to make it into self-raising flour, you would normally put 1 teaspoon of baking powder into the equivalent of 1 cup of normal flour. So I'm going to put 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder into this mix. And then we've got wholemeal flour, 3 cups of this. The wholemeal flour, obviously even back in the early 1900s, was chosen because it was just going to give a more nutrient-dense biscuit for the soldiers. And then I'm popping into here 5 tablespoons of sugar. And 3 tablespoons of milk powder. This original recipe doesn't have any rolled oats in it or eggs. The eggs would have been kept out traditionally because this needed to be a long shelf life biscuit, and also eggs were hard to come by at this time because a lot of the poultry farmers were all at war as well. So eggs were hard to come by a lot of the time. And then we've got a pinch of salt. And then 220 ml of water is going into here as well. I'm just going to give this a mix before I add in the water. So this biscuit was actually eaten almost as a substitute for bread. It had a very long shelf life, but the biscuits were incredibly hard, and apparently some of the soldiers actually preferred to grind them up and eat them like a porridge almost. So I've just made a well and I'm going to add the water. And the recipe just says to mix in the water until it's incorporated, but it will be like lumps of flour and water. So the acronym ANZAC stands for Australia and New Zealand Army Corps, and Anzac Day marks the anniversary of the Anzacs landing on Gallipoli shores. In 1916, the 25th of April was officially named Anzac Day. The Anzacs were all volunteers, and the most significant time to remember them is at dawn, as this is when the original Gallipoli landing happened. Anzac biscuits that we know today traditionally were actually known as Anzac wafers or Anzac Tiles, and they were part of the rations that were given to Anzac soldiers during World War One. This looks really, really dry, but we'll keep going with it at the moment. I'm just trying to incorporate the water as much as I can. I can see why it would be considered a hardtack biscuit. So this is what it's looking like. It's almost like a mixture that has been rubbed together, almost like a scone mixture actually. So I'm just going to follow the recipe. It says that now that the lumps of flour and water has been formed, then I'm going to transfer it to the tabletop. Make sure my tabletop is super clean. So it says to tip it all out onto either a pastry board or onto your tabletop. And I'm just going to mix it until it is a dough. I'm going to have to put some more water in here, to be honest. Okay, so I've just had to add probably about another half a cup of water into this dough to get it into an actual dough. Maybe the flour is different these days to how it used to be 100 years ago. So I've got it in a dough-like consistency now, which is what the recipe calls for. And I'm going to pop it into a bowl and rest it for half an hour. And while this is resting, I'll make a start on the second recipe. The second recipe that we're going to be doing is from 1926. It's a recipe where things like rolled oats and the butter and bicarbonate of soda, golden syrup, all started to be incorporated into these recipes. Into this small pot, I'm just going to pop it onto a medium heat. And we're just going to start by melting half a cup of butter. And while that's melting, we'll get our bicarbonate of soda mixture ready. So I've got 1 teaspoon of baking soda, and 2 tablespoons of boiling water. A little mix. And I'm also going to pop in here a tablespoon of golden syrup. So this is all melted now. And I'm just going to pop in the bicarb of soda mixture. And as you can see, it's just starting to froth up a bit more. We can turn that off now. Nice and frothy. And we'll now mix the wet and the dry ingredients together. So we've got 1 cup of plain flour, a cup of sugar. You can already see that these biscuits are going to be a lot more sweeter than the traditional soldiers biscuits. And 2 cups of rolled oats. 1. Just mix these dry ingredients together, and then I'm going to pop the butter golden syrup bicarb mixture into here. Make a well in the middle. And we'll just give that a good mix. So these biscuits are obviously quite different to what was in the original biscuits, and actually these more sweeter versions of the Anzac biscuit were more commonly sold as like a fundraiser biscuit in the times of war. So families would make these and then sell them. And because it was done during the wartime, that's how they became to be known as Anzac biscuits. The recipe says that you can add a little bit more water if the mixture is a little bit too dry, so I think I'm going to do that because it's quite crumbly. Okay, so that looks a little bit better now. The mixture's come together. So I'm just going to drop teaspoons of this mixture onto a tray. So these are just teaspoons of mixture as per the recipe, and they're just going into a slow oven. I guess I'll start at about 160, 170 degrees Celsius for maybe about 10 minutes, and we'll see how they go. So back to our Anzac tile recipe. These biscuits originally were baked in large industrial ovens, but this recipe that I'm doing now has been done so that you can bake them in just a domestic oven, but they're pretty similar to what originally would have been made for the soldiers. This dough has rested for about half an hour, and I am now rolling the dough into 8mm thick sheets using a rolling pin. Originally, the dough would have been rolled between 2 8mm thick guides to make sure that they were the appropriate height. The rolled dough is then cut into 90mm squares, and I've been able to do this by measuring a piece of cardboard 9 centimeters square on each side, and I've used that as the pattern to ensure uniformity into the tiles. Next, the biscuit squares are docked. This means that a regular horizontal and vertical pattern of holes is pushed into each of them with a flat-ended pin or rod. So the rod is twisted and pushed down to the bottom of the biscuit and then withdrawn, and then it's repeated across the whole biscuit. So each biscuit ends up with 5 vertical and 5 horizontal rows of docker holes, 25 holes in all. These numbers are obviously fairly significant as we celebrate Anzac Day on the 25th as well. These biscuits are then put onto a baking sheet with enough space around them, and a wall is formed around each biscuit with the scrap dough, and this is to help avoid burning the edges of the biscuits. These are now baked at 200 degrees Celsius
for 30 to 40 minutes on the low shelf of the oven, making sure obviously that they do not burn.
These ones here look and smell delicious. These are the ones from the 1926 recipe. They've been in there for about 10 minutes. They didn't spread much at all really, but they smell really yummy. So our Anzac tiles are now done, and we'll show you what they look like. They don't smell sweet at all. They've got very little sugar in them. So they're browned up nicely. They smell almost bread-like, I guess. They mostly are flour. And if I tap them, they're quite solid and crisp on top. My daughter has just said that they look like roof tiles, and I guess that's why they call them Anzac tiles, because they do look like tiles. They almost look like those potato squares that you can get as well. So I'm just trying some of these little bits that I had around the tiles while they were in the oven, and I'm quite pleasantly surprised. I thought because most of it is just flour and water, it's got a tiny little bit of sugar in it, that it would taste quite disgusting, but it's actually quite pleasant. It's got just a very hint of sweetness, but it's nice and chewy inside, and it's almost like a sweet breadstick really. I can see why it would have been suitable to send over to, you know, the hungry soldiers. They could have dipped it into something hot potentially. I baked these for only about half an hour. Any longer and I think they would have been like bricks probably. This last recipe we're going to do is a recipe that you would find today. It's got added extras like maybe brown sugar. Most of the Anzac biscuits that you make today would now have coconut in them as well. So these just provide a bit more flavoursome, nutritious biscuit, I guess, and more like the one that you would find today. So let's get started. So I've got my butter and golden syrup mixture just melting on the stove here, and then into this bowl I'm going to add a cup of rolled oats, a cup of flour and a cup of coconut. It can be thread coconut or desiccated coconut. I've got half a cup of granulated sugar and then a quarter of a cup of brown sugar. A little mix. In my butter golden syrup mixture I've got 100 grams of butter melted and 2 tablespoons of golden syrup, and then I'm going to pop a little bit of baking soda, 3/4 of a teaspoon with 2 tablespoons of water, and that's going to go into my other wet mixture. So this is going to go into my dry ingredients. Smells so yummy even when it hasn't been baked yet. So the mixture has come together really nicely, and I'm now just going to roll them into balls of about a tablespoon size each. About that size. So this is a New Zealand recipe. It's from the Kiwi Country Girl. Just thought I would keep it in theme with a New Zealand recipe. So there's my last little ball. I'm just going to pop that on there. They need enough room to be able to spread if they are going to spread, and then I'm just going to press them down a little bit with a fork, and they're going to go into the oven for 10 to 12 minutes until they are golden brown. These ones look and smell delicious as well.
And here are the finished products. We made a traditional Anzac tile, a soldier's biscuit from a 1926 recipe, and then a modern day Anzac biscuit recipe. Making the Anzac tile gave a little insight into what the rations that were supplied to the soldiers looked and tasted like. They tasted like a slightly sweet bread, were very hard and crunchy, and had a long shelf life. The biscuits would have been wrapped in some way, I imagine, and put in a tin of some kind to provide airtightness. Working backwards here, these modern day Anzac biscuits had the added ingredient extras like brown sugar and coconut. They were lovely and sweet and chewy. The recipe from 1926 was quite basic, but did have a little sugar and golden syrup in it. It was less sweet and chewy in comparison to the modern day recipe, but still tasted and looked like an Anzac biscuit as we know it. And then the tile looks and tastes completely different to the Anzac Day biscuit that we know. Here's to remembering our soldiers on Anzac Day, the 25th of April.